Hello, my name is John Whitehouse and welcome to my presentation. Over the next 20 minutes I will be identifying who the key stakeholders are for the newly constructed University of Greenwich School of Architecture, Design and Construction in the heart of Greenwich. Further analysis of the key stakeholders will prioritise their influence on the closing stages of the Stockwell Street project. I will then provide a communication strategy for these stakeholders to ensure their needs are addressed to reduce their risk on project failure. The Stockwell Street site was purchased by the University of Greenwich in 2009 for £10 million with a plan to construct a new School of Architecture and Construction. The site is 0.65 hectares in size and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The site is situated in Greenwich close to the Royal Navy College and is surrounded by local businesses, areas of interest to tourists, residential areas, local communities, and is well connected with public transport links and will bring revenue and interest into the area. The University of Greenwich has invested £76 million into the project, and the new school will provide many first-class facilities such as lecture theatres, a library, exhibition space, TV studios, a cafe and retail space. The project has achieved BREEAM Excellence and includes an impressive 20% of renewable energy sources. The aim of this presentation is to analyse the project stakeholders, deliver and dwell, and determine the prioritisation and mitigation of the stakeholders through a communication strategy. The construction phase is nearing practical completion, with fit-out phase beginning to start in July this year. This will lead to the end phase and final occupation and actual use of the building in September 2014. With these key stages approaching in the very near future, it is important to understand who the key stakeholders are, their roles and what potential impact they have on the project completion between now and the eventual occupation of the building. Their associated needs must be addressed and any risks mitigated through a communication strategy in order to see a smooth transition period from construction phase to handover. So, what is a stakeholder? Actors which will incur or perceive they will incur a direct benefit or loss as a result of the project. Or a stakeholder is anybody who can affect or is affected by an organisation's strategy or a project. Quite simply, a stakeholder is an internal or external body that has an interest and or influence over the project's success or failure. Understanding stakeholders, as well as their needs, desires, characters, feelings, level of influence, perception, etc., is something that requires strong communication and people skills. The stakeholder management process involves evaluating the needs and expectations of stakeholders in relation to the main objectives of the project. So, how do we identify a stakeholder? Stakeholders can be identified by utilising various techniques such as brainstorming and mind mapping. Specific questions can also be put to the project teams to identify stakeholders likely to be involved. Additionally, by searching documents of previous projects may also help the identification process. However, the focus here will be on key stakeholders for these final stages of the project. Firstly, it is important to identify the key stakeholders that could influence the Stockwell Street project at this fit-out stage. It is also important to recognise there have been other stakeholders throughout the various project stages, and their needs and influences have changed and will continue to change until the project is completed. So, stakeholder classification. Stakeholders can be divided into different categories in order to aid analysis and management of the project, as this diagram shows. There are internal and external stakeholders, which can be further categorised into demand and supply, and private and public. Internal stakeholders will be stakeholders that are internal to the University of Greenwich and are directly involved with the project. External stakeholders will be individuals or groups that are outside of the university that can influence the project's success and are affected by the project. Using this diagram and different categories, I have identified all stakeholders that have an interest within the project. In the internal demand category, I have identified a list of stakeholders. Among these are the client, who is the first key stakeholder. So this is the Dean of the University of Greenwich, including the Chancellors and Heads of Service, the university lecturers and staff, existing and new students, and the end users of the building. These stakeholders are formally connected to the project and will be directly affected by its success or failure. I have also identified a list of internal stakeholders. Among them are Osborne, the main contractor for the project, the fit-out contractors, the project management of the University Greenwich side, the design team, suppliers and manufacturers, the CDM team, and finally the subcontractors. These internal stakeholders have a direct influence on the success of the project in terms of delivering the building to the internal demand stakeholders. Next, I have identified the external stakeholders that have an interest in the project. These include Greenwich Borough Council, Local Authority Building Control, the Emergency Services, Fire Safety Officer and Transport for London. These external public stakeholders will affect the project's success as they have influence and interest in the project closeout stages. The final category is external private stakeholders. These stakeholders will be directly affected by the project and could also affect its success. So we have local business and local residents, neighbours and community groups, the general public and BREEAM. Furthermore, environmentalists, conservationists are included, and their concern with the outcome of the project is justified. Some key stakeholders can merge between internal supply and demand, such as facilities management, ICT department, and service delivery stakeholders, such as security, cleaning, mechanical and electrical services, and so on. This is because they have a demand on the project to be successful, but they also provide success services to the project. So once all the stakeholders have been identified, the next stage in the process is to prioritise them in order to ascertain how much influence they have on the project, and in addition how much interest they have on the project. This is established through a stakeholder matrix, which develops a strategy towards managing the different stakeholders, explores the effect of the stakeholder has on the project, and it determines how important the stakeholders are in relation to the project. Once the stakeholders have been prioritised, this will determine the communication strategy. To prioritise the stakeholders, a simple graph can be shown as shown here. It measures the level of interest of the stakeholder against the stakeholder's level of influence. The four categories are monitor, show consideration, meet the needs, and key player. Each category identifies the level of communication and involvement that stakeholders within each box require. Stakeholders with low interest and low influence should be informed via general communication methods at a lower frequency than other categories. It would be wise to aim and to move stakeholders in the monitor category to the show consideration category. This is because if you can increase their level of interest in the project, they are more likely to have a positive impact on the project and possibly a potential goodwill ambassador. Stakeholders in the show consideration category need more communication and involvement in the project. Their higher interest level means they can be involved in the low risk areas and they can potentially give the project support in their interest area. As we move up the graph, we have meet the needs category. These stakeholders have a high level of influence on the project but a low interest. This is potentially a higher risk to the project's success, as their low level of interest could possibly lead to poor decisions being made, which could adversely have an effect on the project. Stakeholders in this category should be engaged and consulted with their subject areas of interest, and ideally have their level of interest increased in order to make them a key player which is fully informed with a high level of interest in the project. Key players with a high level of interest and a high level of influence should be consulted and engaged regularly with the project. By including this group in major decisions and negotiations, the project is more likely to be a success, as their needs will be addressed and stakeholders will feel more satisfied and involved with the project. In order to prioritise the stakeholders, it is important to understand their needs. Interest, influence over the project, legal issues, rights and what their contribution is. It is important to understand what risks or opportunities they provide at this stage in the project. This would help determine the communication strategy needed in order to finish the project successfully. For the handover stage of the project, the following stakeholders have we identified and placed into the monitor category. Among the list are current students, new students, Transport for London and general public. At this stage of the project, these stakeholders have a low level of interest and a low level of influence over the project's success. Existing and new students will not have much influence or interest, as they are or can, if necessary, use the existing facilities at Avery Hill. The emergency services will eventually need to be informed about the building with the security details and access points, but this is not required at the fit-out stage. However, they will still need to be considered to ensure this information is passed on to them in the future. The same can be said for Transport for London, as their interest and influence was most likely higher at the planning stage of the project. The general public also has a low influence and a low interest at this stage, as the project is near completion. The stakeholders in this category have low needs at this stage of the project. Their contribution and involvement in the project has been considered in the pre-construction phase, and the majority of their needs have already been met. Although these stakeholders are considered to have a low interest and low influence, it is important to ensure they are monitored and kept informed in order to reduce their associated risk. The next category is where stakeholders should be shown consideration. These stakeholders have a high level of interest but a low level of influence. University lecturers and staff have a high level of interest in the project because they are key end users of the building. Their influence has been reduced as the project closeout stage, as their needs and influences would have been higher at previous stages. Their contributions and requirements needed to be dealt with in the earlier stages in order for the design of the building to be finalised. Their thoughts and opinions were needed to be addressed in order for the building to be fully functional for their needs. Local businesses, residents, community groups were consulted at earlier stages in order to satisfy their needs and requirements. Additionally, groups such as conservationists and environmentalists need to be carefully managed. They still have a high interest in the project as they are directly affected by it. However, such groups can coalesce into well-organised movements and are able to mobilise the press behind them. Then severe disruption can be caused. If this looks a possibility, then they may well be able to move into the key stakeholder category. This project will bring more people and more money into the area, which means local businesses and residents will be affected by the amount of end users of the building. As this building is near the local area and the community have the right to be kept informed of the progress and other information that may affect them, which is why they have been categorised in the show consideration. The next category has a low level of interest but a high level of influence over the project. These stakeholders include the Greenwich Borough Council, Building Control, Fire Safety Officer and BREEAM. Their category is Keep Satisfied. Greenwich Borough Council would have been a key stakeholder at the beginning stages of the project. However, they will need to be kept satisfied as the building must continue to meet planning conditions imposed on by the project from the outset. This will include all environmental aspects of the project and meeting the local plan. Their interests would have been higher at the beginning stages of the project as they would have needed the works to be met all planning conditions. The planners would have been consulted very early on in the project in order to discuss the requirements and needs of the council. Local authority building control have a high level of influence as they need to sign off work at the required stages. As the project is at the closing stages, they may still need to carry out several inspections in order to meet building regulations. However, this requirement has now been reduced because the building is nearly practical completion. Without their approval, the project could fail because delays putting the works right could affect the programme for the fit-out contractors and therefore mean the building is not ready for occupation in September. It is also a legal requirement for building control to carry out site visits and sign off work at various stages. However, their personal interest in the project has been reduced as they are a local authority with many other projects needing site visits and approval. The Fire Safety Officer will need to inspect the fire risk assessment works to ensure they conform to the required standard. The fire alarm commissioning will also need to begin in order to meet health and safety requirements. This stakeholder is important because their input and confirmation the building is safe to use, the project would fail as it could not be used. This is why they need to be kept satisfied and informed about the project process. BREEAM and UNESCO will also need to keep satisfied as they will need to check the building upon completion to ensure it meets their criteria for conforming that the original proposed plan submitted to them has been followed. The same would apply to UNESCO, that keeping the project within the parameters of the organisation requirements would ensure that it meets their needs. The final category contains stakeholders which have a high level of interest and a high level of influence on the project's success. These stakeholders will be key players and will need constant consultations and communications in order to meet the programme. These stakeholders include Osborne, the main contractor, the various fit-out contractors, the project managers, the design team, which includes the architect and the QS, engineers, etc., the CDM team, subcontractors, facilities management, manufacturers and suppliers, and service delivery contractors. These stakeholders have a direct impact on the success in the close-out stages of the project. The main contractor must complete on time in order to allow fit-out contractors to complete their contract ready for occupation in September. Similarly, the fit-out contractors must adhere to their programme and work closely with Osborne to ensure project success. The project managers are key players as they ensure the project is running to programme. They are also a key link of communication between all parties, especially the client. The Dean, Councillors and Heads of Services are also all key players as their reputation is at stake, along with their businesses and planning budgeting, forecasting and investors for the new building. The design team and CDM specialists are key players as they have control over many aspects of the project. These teams will be responsible for the various areas of the contract, such as specifications, programming, planning, quality checks, valuations, health and safety, engineering and so on. These teams will be key right through the project completion. Their influence is very high and the project's success depends on them. They have fully contributed throughout the process and their knowledge of the project is invaluable. In terms of the CDM coordinator, they are involved in the project to facilitate good communication between the client, designers and contractors. They prepare and update the health and safety file and notify details of the project to the HSE, cementing their significance as a key stakeholder. Suppliers and manufacturers and subcontractors are also key players at this stage as their services, equipment and planned works will need to be programmed carefully to ensure completion and setup ready for organisation. If these are not in place, the building may not be fully operational or functional and therefore cause the project not to meet completion dates. Facilities management is in the key stakeholder category because they will be responsible for operational tasks once the project is completed. They need to have a knowledge and competence of the building operation in order to ensure a smooth transition into occupation by the end users. Similarly, service delivery contractors such as security, cleaning, catering, M&E services are key players as they need to have full knowledge and competence surrounding the project in order to provide their services at occupation stage, which is fast approaching. This brings us on to the communication strategy and mitigation. Now the stakeholders have been prioritised, a communication strategy can be put in place to meet their needs and requirements. The aim of the communication strategy is to ensure that all stakeholders have the opportunity to contribute in the decision making at the appropriate stage of the project. They establish clear and communication objectives, identify the messages that must be conveyed to persuade all stakeholders to support the project and engage with its goals. Typical messages will show the benefits to the stakeholders of the project, in which it adapts to the stakeholder and there is no one-fits-all approach. It is invaluable to have a record of stakeholders and their interests incorporated into a communication strategy and plan to ensure all stakeholders have access to information. A schedule of identified key stakeholders will be provided, with the inclusion of contract details, and will also state individual interests and reasons for being involved. The overall schedule can be kept on the electronic database spreadsheet document with each contact in a different cell. So, how will the plan be communicated? Various communication techniques can be adopted depending on the level of stakeholder you are communicating with. Some examples of different techniques are workshops, meetings, forums, email, notice board, posters, letter drops. Here I have identified group specific communication in relation to the stakeholder matrix shown earlier. Group A is minimal effort, obviously Group B is keep informed, Group C keep satisfied, Group D keep players. All stakeholders that were identified within Group A category have a minimal effort of communication, notifying of key milestones. This will be in the form of websites, intranet, posters and notice boards. Group B category stakeholders will be kept informed of key milestones through bi-monthly group emails, open forums and posters. All stakeholders that were identified in Group C category will be kept satisfied at programme appropriate stages through interest-specific meetings, regular emails relating to specific information and detail, and verbal one-on-one communications. And finally, the key players will be kept in constant contact of the project milestones through regular meetings, workshops, targeted emails, regular verbal discussions and visits. The communications responsibility is to list times when the official communication must take place and identify named people who have responsibility for communicating information to other team or group members, the client and other stakeholders. It is essential that the communication is a two-way process, since the information should have moved both inwards and outwards, having the desired effect. The communication process, combined with good record keeping, will ensure effective delivery of the project and mitigation of any risks. Information should be made available on request, and openness in communication will promote a free exchange of ideas, promote more inclusive decision making, identify problems at an early stage, and finally decrease potential conflict. Successful delivery of the plan will only happen if buy-in is achieved from everyone who's involved. Individual stakeholders will change throughout the course of the project. Power and interest levels of the stakeholders will change as stages progress. Ignoring and not addressing a stakeholder can increase interest and power, more often in a negative manner. Thank you, and that concludes my presentation.